Good afternoon and welcome everyone. First of all, our apologies. We're running slightly late with this program because some of our speakers who were joining us from different countries were facing tech issues, as it happens. We're terribly sorry, but we're going to try and make up for lost time now. Let me quickly get into the agenda. My name is Sunaina and I'm a senior fellow at the Center for New Economic Diplomacy. Welcome to this webinar, Africa in 2021 towards a digital, sustainable and equal society. I would now like to invite Ambassador Navdeep Suri, who is our chair for this session, and he is also Distinguished Fellow and the Director at the Center for New Economic Diplomacy, to deliver the welcome note.
Thank you, Sunaina, and a very warm welcome to all the participants. I'm delighted that we have with us representatives from Kenya, from South Africa, from Egypt, and from Botswana. And I have to say that I've got a personal association with at least three of those countries. I've spent 3 years in Dar es Salaam, 3 years next to Kenya, 3 years in Johannesburg, and 6 in Cairo. So I have a very strong personal commitment to this project. Which falls within the rubric of the Center for New Economic Diplomacy at the Observer Research Foundation. ORF, of course, is India's largest, most dynamic think tank. And our center was established a couple of years back with this interesting concept that can we work towards creating platforms that bring communities together, bring organizations together, bring individuals together with a kind of a lighthouse approach. Are there things that we can learn? Are there things that we can share? Are these platforms where best practices can be shared, and hopefully each one of us emerges a little bit more aware as a result of these conversations. We didn't intend originally to have these things completely virtual. In fact, in 2019, we did our flagship Kigali Global Dialogue, which was our first attempt really to build a platform or a community of scholars. But then, of course, COVID intervened. But Africa remains front and center in the focus of the center. And, we've been trying to do a range of activities throughout this pandemic period, which help us stay true to our original vision, which is to try and look at new areas of economic diplomacy, which are emerging, whether it is climate change and resilient infrastructure, whether it is human capital, including both education and health. How can we leverage technology for development? How do we make sure that gender remains a cross-cutting theme across everything that we do? But most important, as I said, is to see whether we can forge these communities. So I'm delighted that we were able to work with a number of our guest scholars from across Africa to do this Africa 2021 document. We got inputs, we got perspectives. My colleague Aditi put it all together. And today we wanted to build upon that initiative of, receiving your perspectives on Africa 2021, to take that conversation a step further, and to hear some of the voices which we seriously take note of, and which will go into a report that we will do about not just the impact of the pandemic. I think all of us are aware of that, but where do we go from here? And that's where I think that today's topic is so relevant. I can tell you, in India, the pace of transition, not just in work from home, but in trying to address issues of global health and education through technology, has really leapfrogged. We see it in the edutech sector, we see it in the health tech sector, we see the number of startups which are coming with amazing innovative ideas. And one of the things that we are looking at is which of these have the potential to be replicated and scaled up into other countries, and which are the ones that are similarly happening in other spaces that could perhaps find a home in India. So that's the two-way process that we've been trying to look at. We were talking earlier as we were waiting for the tax issues to be resolved about our vaccination program. The fact that India has been able to provide vaccines to about 70 countries already, which is not surprising because even before the pandemic, India used to supply about 60% of the world's supply of vaccines. And so really, whether it is the AstraZeneca vaccine or the others, we've been central to this whole process. I know that for a fact that we've sent consignments to Kenya and to Egypt and to South Africa. And in a sense, there's a bit of a contrast with the vaccine nationalism approach that some of the developed countries are following, where it's me first, and then we will think about anyone else. Or what India is trying to do is we've ramped up our capacity to about 3 million vaccines per day, vaccinations per day, but we're also at the same time trying to make sure that we share a good chunk with the rest of the world. I think the current numbers that I saw was something like 56% of our total output is being exported to other countries. But coming back to the technology and the digitalization theme, so when I get my first vaccine shot, I basically have to go on a portal and I log in, and it tells me which is the center closest to me based on my zip code, where I can get a vaccination, which has slots available. And I land up there with the proof of ID and my mobile. And once my vaccine shot is done, I get an SMS saying you can download your certificate from this link. And that's how sort of smooth it is. And so tomorrow, if we are to overcome this pandemic and move towards vaccine certificates or green cards or whatever people are talking about, I think some of these technology interventions are going to be critical to that process. But really, we are very keen to hear from you, your views on the theme that we have for this afternoon. And I'm going to hand the floor to Sunaina to moderate the conversation as we move forward with the little comment that we are hoping to have a colleague of ours from the Ministry of External Affairs join us during the course of the conversation. You're not the only ones who are having tech issues. He's had one as well. So as soon as he's able to join us, we'll see where maybe towards the end of the conversation we can bring him in. Sunaina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Suri. And you've touched upon a lot of topics that I'm sure we would like to return to later on in the discussion. I'm now going to be introducing very briefly the topic for today's session and also our wonderful panel. Africa, like the rest of the world, has been grappling with the fallout of the pandemic, and it has halted the development and economic progress throughout the continent. But can this moment be an opportunity for inclusive growth and for Africa to tap into its potential? To discuss this today, we have amongst us Jiska de Groot. She is a researcher at the Energy Research Center in South Africa. She will be speaking about the need for access to energy in a post-pandemic society. Motshepi Matsheng is the co-founder at Young Love Organization in Botswana, and she will be talking about the opportunities in edutech. Grace Mutungu is a research fellow at Center for IP and IT Law at Strathmore University in Kenya. She will be talking about digital rights and financial inclusion. Lobna Kerry is here, and she is an assistant lecturer at the Department of Journalism at Modern University of Science and Technology in Egypt, and she will be speaking about media management and regulation. Abhishek Mishra is a junior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. He will be talking about trends in Africa's digital economy and India-Africa cooperation in the digital sphere. We also have Sheena Magenya, who will be joining us shortly. She's facing a tech problem, but she is the coordinator for All Women Count Take Back the Tech project at the Association for Progressive Communication in Kenya, and she will be talking about the opportunities for women in tech. So we have a wonderful panel, very diverse and representing many parts of Africa. And a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to our audience for taking out time. Each of our speakers will be speaking for about 7 minutes, and we will be opening the floor to the audience for questions right after that. And I'm going to hand over to Jiska now.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity for me to share some of my thoughts in this panel today. My contribution today focuses on energy access as a precondition to engage in this new, vibrant, exciting digital not even post-COVID, a COVID-19 society, and something that's really necessary for African society so that they can be part of this move towards the sustainable digital and equal society. And I will be using some of the societal transitions in Africa, and there are many. So we've seen these transitions to decolonization, democracy, and now towards what we call like a COVID-proof society. But equally important and sort of underlying a lot of these other transitions that are happening isn't the idea of this energy transition, and where energy transitions, in particular in the literature and the rhetoric of the global north, are generally associated with this move towards a low carbon, renewable energy driven energy system, really to clean up energy supplies. In Africa, we have a different parallel and essential transition happening towards access to energy for all. So it's achieving Sustainable Development Goal 7. And really in the next few minutes, I will argue and show you some examples of our daily lives, of how African countries are sometimes limited to engage in like a COVID-19 digital society, and that energy access is very much underlying some of these potential for success. So COVID-19 has brought about a shift from like human interaction, so face-to-face interaction, to interaction through digital technology. Like that's not new to anybody else. Like we've seen this mushrooming of digital tools to connect, to do business, to teach, to learn, and also to maintain our social contacts. And whereas a little over a year ago, many of us, I guess, a little bit naively thought that this transition to a whole new digital world in which researchers, decision makers, and practitioners could engage remotely, that it would take a long time. And less than a year later, hey, it's become the norm. And so at present, many of us engage via Zoom, Skype, Teams, many of the other platforms on a regular, often on a daily basis. And we really seem to be rapidly transitioning towards this new digital society. Unfortunately, not all of us are able to be part of this digital society, because who partakes now in society, in this sort of almost like a new economy, depends in part who has access to digital technology, and whether that means to the technology itself or the access to electricity to run the technology. And that's a real issue in Africa, because many Africans lack access to electricity. Their access may be unreliable or insufficient, and as a result, they can find themselves outside of this new and emerging society. So access to digital technology is highly dependent on energy access. And as a consequence, the COVID crisis can really deepen existing inequalities in this field, not just by the well-known metrics related to economic growth and jobs, but many at the moment run the risk of being left behind in the move towards a digital society because they lack the access to the prerequisite of being able to operate digitally, and electricity is really like a key point in that. So let me show that to you via like a very brief example of what's happening here in South Africa. And South Africa has one of the highest electrification rates on the continent. So at the moment, it's all plain sailing. I'm able to connect with you all online. I have internet, my computer is nicely plugged in, but in only a few hours from now, the electricity in my area of the city will be off for a few hours. This happens at set intervals during regular load shedding periods because South Africa's energy system cannot meet demand at this point in time for a variety of reasons that I don't have the time to go into, but it just can't meet the demand. So sometimes when multiple of our power plants are offline, we lack access to electricity, sometimes up to 3-4 times a day for 2.5 hours. So that really impacts a working day for a lot of people. And still, we are the lucky ones that when we're not load shedding, have good electricity connections and can afford to pay our electricity bills. So most of the times we can participate in online meetings and continue our work digitally. Others, however, are not so lucky because they either lack access to electricity, can't afford their electricity, or simply lack access to the technologies. And as you can imagine, sometimes something as simple as having access to electricity has enormous knock-on effects of people's ability to partake in our digital society. And another example quite close to my heart here is that of our students. When our official lockdown started on the 26th of March 2020, where nobody was allowed to leave the house for about 5 weeks, only to do basic grocery shopping, but no other retail businesses, restaurants, etc., were allowed to open. It came as a surprise to our leaders at the University of Cape Town that some of our students were unable to continue their schooling, because many of our students had gone back to the rural areas to be with their families during this really quite uncertain time, but also driven by a lack of income, a desire to be home, and a lack of housing, as the residences and halls also had to close. So many of our poor students therefore had unreliable or no internet connections. They couldn't afford them at the level that was needed for online teaching, or they were hindered by unstable, unreliable, or an absolute lack of electricity at their homes. So fortunately, UCT, as one of the wealthier institutions, was able to provide support for their students. But for the majority of South Africans, this is not the reality. They do not have the support of an organization like UCT to help them access the digital society. So load shedding or no load shedding, they are still running the risk of being left behind. So in a COVID-19 digital society, countries that have limited access to electricity or unreliable access will be struggling, and we need to make sure that they don't get left behind. So for societies to really adjust in this inclusive manner, reliable energy access is needed because of the dependence of digital technologies on this access. And so although this transition is incredibly promising and interesting, and I truly believe that there is an enormous potential for inclusivity and sustainability and progress in this area, we need to make sure that whatever we're doing goes hand in hand with enabling people to be part of this society. So really leave nobody behind. And only then I think we will be able to really call society a digital, equal and sustainable society, not just for those that have access to the resources, but for everybody in African countries and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jiska. And that's really indeed a sobering reminder as we all move towards digital technology and embracing the future, that we can't leave many behind. I would now like to invite Mochipi to speak next.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Hope everyone can see my slide. I have included a brief presentation just to give and highlight what we have been up to as Young Love organization. As a way of introduction, we are an organization that is based here in Botswana, and one of the largest youth serving organizations in the country. And our mission really is to translate academic rigorous research into high impact health and education programming. And to date, we have been able to work in the spaces of education and health, very much closely working with government in collaborating on our programming in schools. So just really excited to be on this panel today to just share more on the work that we've been doing during during the pandemic and even post when schools were open. So currently right now in Botswana, schools are open. And we are really excited to still continue our approaches on remote learning. And therefore, we'll get more into what we did during when schools were closed, but also, again, how we envision the future of using digital work to advance learning in schools. So really excited to be here. So just on to the next slide, I'll just share a little bit more of what we're doing prior to the pandemic. We were very much actively working with the Ministry of Basic Education to deliver an intervention called Teaching at the Right Level, which the idea on Teaching at the Right Level is to group students according to their different learning abilities and then target to teaching using very fun and simple learning games. And the emphasis of it is that students often at times are taught to be at grade level or what the syllabus has said. But in Botswana, we have found that almost 32% of students can do division or subtraction. So there are a number of students that are falling behind quite significantly, and we do need to work towards closing and bridging the learning gaps that exist in schools by building foundational skills. So when we talk about foundational skills, we are really referring, for example, in the maths example, we are talking about the ability to do addition, to do subtraction and division and so forth. So we were very much, I would say our model of delivery was very school based. We reached over 15 to 20% of all primary schools in the country. And our hope was really to expand, to more regions and schools in the country. But because of the pandemic, we had to really shift the way we are delivering our work, but also think about innovative ways in order to be able to reach the students and the students that we work with. And therefore, just before the schools were closed last year during March, we quickly collected phone numbers of parents and students that we work with. And the idea was to see how we could still bridge the learning loss at school level, but also just to help students continuously learn, particularly because there is a learning challenge and a learning crisis in the country even before the pandemic. So really that was our motivation to now think more of this low-tech approach, and we'll explain the reasons why. So what we did initially, we ran a trial for over 10 weeks where we had students that were only receiving weekly bulk SMSs. And then on the other arm, we had a combination of SMSs as well as phone calls so that we can be able to evaluate which low-tech approach would work effectively. We believe that from the lessons that we've learned and what we have been able to see, the graph on my right shows that generally low to middle income countries would have very much low rates of access to internet, slightly below 40%. But then also what we find is that someone at household level owns a simple feature phone. This phone has no internet, but it can be able to call and text. So our motivation between doing low tech work was ways in which we could really ensure that it is scalable, but also easily accessible in each household and to each student. So though the student wouldn't have access to a phone, someone at the household level will have access to a phone. So this is just some of the thinking around contributing ideas on the digital space to think, how do we really maximize what we currently have, but also very much what can be easily accessible at each household, whether it is in the urban side or the rural areas. So hence the motivation for us to do low tech work. And as I've mentioned, this is even more relevant during the crisis and even before, and even after the crisis, to say that we have teacher strikes or fires where schools will be shutting down. So these low-tech solution is not only thinking about the now, but also again in the eventuality that there are school closures for a number of reasons that may happen. So again, these are conversations that I think are very important as we are talking on the panel. Just also to iterate what we did. So we would send weekly SMSs to the parent's phone, or even the caregiver's phone, whoever lived with the student. And these SMSs will be very much simple so that they're easily understood by the parent, but also, again, more on a frequent basis. We also would follow up with a phone call to be able to see if the student, understands the question, but also, again, if they needed any additional support in the work that we carried out. And what you can be able to see, and also just that I haven't included in this slide, is initially when we started, we conducted, phone assessments using the ASA tool, which is very much a simple, 5 to 10 minute phone call that we conducted to students to be able to gauge which level they're in, so that when we do send out the SMSs, we can target the information correctly. So in essence, we would know where the student is at in terms from the ASA test, in terms of the level of the student, whether they're at addition or at their division. And depending on where they were at, we would send them the material that's very much targeted, to their level. What we found also from these results, it was very much the first time that we were working directly with parents. Because we really needed to get them on board, as they served as teachers at household level. So that was a very new experience that we needed to embark on. And we were happy that we were successful to get parents, on board, and as well as engaged with the emphasis of delivering information in this manner. Some of the results on this trial, which we have also published in a number of papers. Some of the results, just to share, we received, over 80% of parents showing engagement with the students. So this means that, there were a number of parents and students really engaging in this content and willing to be able to sit down with their kids and learn together, which I think this approach really brought insights into how students and parents can be involved in each other's learnings. We also saw a boost in learning, with over 31% of students who are now able to do basic, numeracy in terms of subtraction and addition. So whilst also this intervention provided a lot of support to students, we did find that for the phone and SMS combination, there were some learning achieved during this time. And I think the big takeaway as we continue embarking in this journey together is to just figure out ways in which we could really prevent learning loss. And it is quite a challenging time and a challenging period for students really across the globe. So we'd just also like to mention where we could see this work taking forward, in also ensuring that we are creating a sustainable, digital platforms. As I've mentioned before, during the pandemic, we saw billions of children without education. I don't think I need to iterate more of this, but this is also a challenge across many African countries where schools were closed, and even some schools remain closed. We also ran one of the first experimental evidence on minimizing the fallout of the pandemic on education. So we have a lot of work that's just centered around what we did in terms of the experimental evidence, but also how to conduct phone assessments, as well as just engaging parents throughout this process. So we'll share, the links so that we can be able to access these papers, even post this call. And we believe that there is a long-term implications of the role of technology and parents in a child's education. The low-tech approach, whilst not new, to say that, there are phones that exist, it is important to recognize that technology plays a huge role, in learning, but also again to think through how can we continuously prevent learning loss during a pandemic, but also even post, right, where to support students in. And we also found that low tech is promising relative to high tech. As I've mentioned, there are many countries that may have access to internet and tablet, but in Botswana, the numbers are very low. So whilst we design the future of digital work, we need to think more about what is easily accessible to students, but also again to really encourage learning during these times. So we have shown that it is possible, and low tech, is one solution to be able to encourage learning. And also just to say that, parent-teacher interactions, which are standard in the education system, might be enhanced by direct content engagement. So the usual practice would be that parents will form a part of the parent-teacher associations, will also meet with teachers, in upon demand, or when they go collect their report cards at the end of every term. But what we have been able to show from this work is that whilst you establish a working relationship with the parent and share with them material for learning with their student, it is actually possible. So instead of it being more passive, direct engagement with parents really encourages the students to want to learn, but also again to really be attentive to where the students' levels are, to know what the student knows and doesn't know. But also, again, can be able to support the students in this journey. So that is just very much, just sharing more of our work. We're hoping partners do join on board to be able to replicate some of our lessons learned in Botswana in other contexts. We have already, began lots of this replication work in Kenya with New Globe Organization, as well as Teach for Nepal, which is currently undergoing a similar trial and similar learnings that we did in Botswana. So that said, I would just appreciate to say that thank you all for really this opportunity to be part of this panel on building towards a digital, sustainable, equitable society. I believe when we started in these conversations, and as well as having, Ambassador Suri here with us on the call, it's very much important, and we truly appreciate the opportunity to be able to present today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mochipi. And it's also interesting that the case study that you brought up, Teaching at the Right Level, was started by the Indian NGO Pratham, and it's actually the perfect example of India-Africa Development Cooperation, which is also what we're here for. Our next speaker, I would like to invite Lobna Kerry. I should also mention that Mr. Gujjar has finally been able to join us, and sir, we will be inviting you to deliver closing remarks. Lobna, it's over to you now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored and proud to be here today. And I've actually got lost in the amazing initiative for Young Love. This is amazing what you're doing, and I'm honored to be among such esteemed panelists. And I would like to take my first words from what Ambassador Suri had started, talking about equality and talking about having sustainable technological accessibility to our country. When I'm talking now, of course, I'm talking about Egypt in specific. So gender is an issue when it comes to technological access. As my role in the National Council for Women, I'm a member in the Media Committee, and therefore it has been noticed, especially during COVID-19 times, that the accessibility of women and their level of education. So therefore we're addressing in Egypt the importance of including media literacy in our curriculums and digital literacy as well. And of course, this goes hand in hand with what Jessica was talking about in her speech, saying that we really need proper infrastructures to try to facilitate the access of technology and the ease with which all people and to achieve, of course, equality in that matter. That being said, I will move to what I'm here to talk about today, which is media regulations and the challenges during the COVID-19 and how things, the media sphere has changed. But let me start with the idea that still to this day, the traditional media is ranked number one in Egypt. I'm talking about television, I'm talking about radio. Most of the households, the recent number says that we have 98% of Egyptian households with television, and this did not or was not affected by COVID-19. But this does not mean that the media industry financially or economically was not affected, because the shift has already happened to online media. We have a internet penetration rate of 49.5%. This means that almost half of our population is with internet access, and they're using social media and online platforms. This has caused quite a stir in the traditional media business-wise, because the advertisements and the advertisers, of course, they have already shifted to online, which caused a struggle for the sustainability and the existence of traditional media. We've seen many layoffs, we've seen downsizes in traditional media outlets. I'm talking about television stations, I'm talking about print media in terms of newspapers. The magazines are almost non-existing in the Egyptian market. Very few public magazines or publicly published magazines, not the private sectors. Everything has moved to online so far. But the good thing from the pandemic, that the advertisers who were struggling to believe in the power of online to catching customers, they are more now confident to hold their advertisements in the online sphere. Whether we're talking about social media, we're talking about online news platforms. So this is one thing. But the same shift has been witnessed as well when it comes to regulations or when it comes to media law, because first, in Egypt, the online media or the digital media has been treated as an extension of traditional media. And then with the practice of the professional practice, of course, of the digital media, there has been many difficulties or many issues and ethical issues as well, and how we're going to deal with it in terms of litigations and laws. And therefore, there has been an introduction in 2018 to new media law and cyber crime law as well. Those laws have presented also a struggle of power between the existence of the SCMR, which is the Supreme Council for Media Regulations, and the newly restated Ministry of State for Media. And so this struggle of power between who has the final say when it comes to censorship, when it comes to controlling what is being broadcasted, and as well, this is why I'm here today to talk about a very important issue, which is media literacy and how it's going to affect governing the media, whether we're talking about a time of crisis or we're talking about in general, because still the idea of freedom of expression and the now available accessibility of internet, and everyone has a voice, and there are free platforms that people can express what they're thinking. Who's going to control this? We're talking about the freedom of expression for the press and how much it is going to be affected by the new law, and therefore the struggle is still happening. Even as professionals, we are trying to figure out means to present a professional and ethically considerate media coverage to different issues and withstand the difficult circumstances. But as well, we're trying to maintain the capacity for or even encourage more pluralism to this sphere. And so there are different business models that have been introduced. We're relying more on social media. the streaming platforms. We have newly introduced almost during the start of COVID-19, Watch It to compete with Netflix and so forth. The advertisements and the subscription models have changed drastically. So the internet or the digital sphere is now more promising when it comes to profit maximization more than the traditional. But as I said, this is presenting a threat to preserving traditional media, and therefore the managing the media itself and trying to keep the employees and the professionality of this profession is still at stake. But I believe, Yani, this is my own opinion, and I really believe that once media literacy becomes part of our education system, once we have a solid infrastructure where people have access to the internet, once there is a legislative balance between traditional media and online, where the censorship is equally, I don't want to say divided, but just loosened for both traditional and online, I think this whole dilemma or this whole sphere is going to get balanced once again. And thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lubnan. It's interesting that just like Egypt has been debating the new media law, we in India are also bringing in regulation for digital websites and social media, and we are also having debates and discussions around that. So that would be something to return to. I would now like to invite our next speaker, Grace, to join us.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
It is a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for, among other things, the kind of South-to-South exchange that is happening here, because sometimes we tend to discuss things that are happening in the North and comparing with what is happening in the South, and missing a lot of contextual and nuanced things. And so I'm very, very grateful for this kind of knowledge sharing. And I bring from Kenya. Kenya is a country on the eastern part of Africa, and we are known for many, many things. And one of the things that I don't think is spoken enough about Kenya is the issue of mobile money. Before Corona, I had the privilege of traveling to other places, and I was always surprised at how much further ahead Kenya is in terms of mobile money, because I think if we were to keep count of the new words that we add to the Kenyan lingo or the dictionary, one new verb that has come up in less than 10 years is M-Pesa. And to M-Pesa, somebody just basically means to send them money via their mobile phone. It has become so usual in society that it's kind of a verb. And so one of the things that has enabled this kind of high use of money is the really, really high mobile penetration. Before mobile came, telephony was something that was reserved for a few. Landline telephones was reserved for a few in the bigger cities and so on. But the Kenyan culture, which I guess is the culture in a lot of African countries where there has rural to urban migration, is that people always needed ways of connecting with people back home, whether it's by talking to them or whether it's contributing to community events that were taking place back in their rural homes. And so this is one of the factors that has really led to, really high use of mobile communications in general and mobile money in particular. And so when the pandemic was declared last year, I'd say that although like many other low and middle income countries, we were very unprepared for the new life under the pandemic, I'd say to some extent we were really well prepared for a cashless economy. And just to further buttress this, what the Central Bank of Kenya did, they gave directives that made it free or costless to transfer amounts of below $10. And if you look at the numbers or the statistics that were filed with the communications regulator and also with the financial regulator, you notice that there was a huge increase in mobile money transactions last year, meaning that people are ready for the cashless economy. And the other insight we got from this is that the cost of cash transfers or mobile money transfers may have been locking out a large number of people from using mobile money. So they already had money, they were ready to use mobile, but only barrier was the cost, because the mobile network operators normally charge a fee in order for you to transfer money. And there are quite a number of lessons to learn from this, especially for the financial inclusion movement, which has been looking at alternatives to banking and other alternatives for including the unbanked and the ones who do not have access to financial services. There are a lot of lessons to learn from looking at Kenya. And one lesson is that the existing mobile telephony network is really key and can really be used to enable a cashless society. And and there are so many applications for that. The other lesson is that there cannot be financial inclusion if the cost of transfers is too high. If somebody has to between buying food for their family versus sending money, And interestingly, later in the year, as the year was coming to an end, first of all, the mobile money operators had already complained about these cost-free transfers. Some of them estimate that they lost close to 19 billion in revenue because of this costless mobile money transfers. And so the regulator, by the end of the year, announced that we would be going back to, mobile money with cost, but announced also that they would be introducing a principles-based system for mobile money pricing, for pricing of the transfers. And so the mobile money or the mobile network operators have been given some principles to abide by as they come up with the prices or the tariffs for mobile money transfer. And this is something that started to be applied in January this year. So it's something that we are still watching, and it's actually something quite interesting, not only just for Kenya, but for other countries that are also in the process of liberalizing their mobile networks or inviting, private investment in the mobile network economy. And a case in point is Ethiopia, which for a long time has had a state-run, telecom company, but is now inviting others. The other point I wanted to make is that now, as this whole economy builds up, and something that we are also learning from Kenya is the issue of data and data protection and data governance in general. Because something that happens is that as people are using mobile money, there's been a lot of interest, and Kenya is one of the countries with a really high number of digital lending apps. And these digital lending apps work by you install the app on a smartphone, and then it reads your data and determines your credit worthiness. So from a financial inclusion perspective, this is very good because you do not need collateral. You just need your. But increasingly, there are questions being raised from a data protection perspective. There are questions such as, what do they do with credit worthiness and given you a mobile loan? There are reports showing evidence of this data, being transferred outside Kenya to markets such as California, to data analytic companies, and this is something that now shows that in the coming future, regulators have to work together. It is no longer an issue. Digital lending apps will no longer be an issue of the financial regulator or the communications regulator. The data protection regulator will also come in. And so as we move forward, I think the issue of co-regulation is one of the other lessons that we are learning from the pandemic, that the more we get into the digital economy, the more issues become, quite diverse from just one kind of issue. And so as I come to the end, I'd like to say that it is not kind of a binary that there are now advantages of the mobile economy and disadvantages of. No, it's there are quite that need to be looked at, and there are a lot of use cases for this digital economy and mobile money. One of it, which we have already seen being very much applied, especially during the pandemic, is cashless. The restriction of movement, especially last year during the first wave, and the government was not able to reach to the remote parts of Kenya. But as long as there was a mobile network availability in those areas or coverage in those areas, the government was able to give cash transfers to the very vulnerable members of society in those areas. And this reduces costs in the first place because it doesn't need a very big outlay of staff and other people to deliver the program, because this can just be done directly to that person's mobile number. And it can also be used for many other, this kind of distributive or welfare programs. The digital technologies are really key in that. But like I said, from what we've learned from the issue of digital loans, we really need to get it right. We need to talk about data governance from the word go. We need to know where the data is going. People need the privacy policies. Sometimes, people just click and accept. But things are in high legalese. These things need to be broken down, and it needs to start from a culture of protecting the human rights by default, not just privacy, but all the human rights that are involved by default. But I definitely invite everybody to keep watching this case of Kenya and mobile money. It's quite advanced use of mobile money, and it has a lot of promises for making society more, equitable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Happy that you brought up the question of human rights as we discuss the digital economy. Our next speaker, in fact, is Abhishek, and I know that he's our in-house nerd on digital economy and mobile money in Africa and in India. So it's over to you, Abhishek.
Hi, thank you, Sunaina. Am I audible? First of all, a very warm welcome to my co-panelist. Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Abhishek Mishra. I'm a junior fellow at ORF, researching on African issues, and I also am pursuing my PhD from University of Delhi. Today, my intervention, I'll be speaking a bit on India and Africa, the emerging trends of India and Africa's digital cooperation. Now, so what we are witnessing is that in the last decade, there has been a big surge in digital innovations and also mobile phone ownership across developing nations. This has certainly been true in the case of sub-Saharan African countries as well as India. But Africa as an entire continent, it unregrettably continues to trail other regions of the world in terms of digital penetration, usage, and capability. Now, Africa's digital infrastructure is still somehow lingering in its early growth stages. But at the same time, it is important for us to note that although Africa remains geographically divided, there is still immense potential to unify the continent through digital and emerging technologies. Now, today, we are seeing that the Africa, it represents a very fertile territory to drive innovation, which seeks to tackle some of the continent's pressing needs and also to develop some commercially viable opportunities. We have seen that across the continent, there has already been a growing spread of networks, sensors, automation, as well as AI. Due to this, several emerging technologies are proliferating, such as drones or CCTV cameras with facial recognition technology, smart cities, etc. Drones and all, we have seen that they are supplying life-saving medical supplies to remote locations across Africa, as we have, for example, the great work which is Zipline and all is doing. In terms of mobile internet penetration also in Africa, we see that countries like Kenya and Tanzania especially, they have the highest level of internet penetration with around over 75% internet penetration in these two countries. Even countries like South Africa and Nigeria, they have modest amount of internet access. But unfortunately, countries like DRC or Mali, Mozambique, Angola, Niger, Chad, they have lower than 25% internet penetration. We do know that mobile phones, they are a primary platform for internet access because they allow users to conduct both e-commerce and e-trade. But while more people across sub-Saharan Africa are increasingly, they do own mobile phones, unfortunately, smartphone adoption has remained modest in this region. Currently, we see that only 1/4 of Africa's population has access to internet, but it is hoped that by 2030, over this decade, Africa could achieve somehow a sort of a rough parity with the rest of the world, when it is hoped that around 3/4 of African populations are projected to get access to internet. Mobile technologies also, they generate millions of jobs in the continent, and also they contribute to nearly 8.5% of Africa's GDP, which comes to about roughly around 145 billion. So there has also been evidence to suggest that African countries which have successfully fought off diseases in the past, like Ebola, through effective tracking or tracing and treating, all these countries, they have relied heavily on access to technology to fight off these diseases. So naturally, then a tech-enabled and digitized Africa will be essential to fight not only the current health pandemic, but also future viral outbreaks, and also to ensure that vulnerable people and communities, they are all identified and traced. Although while African governments, they need to place emphasis on and prioritize, designing their policies which increases access to internet or internet connectivity. At the same time, parallelly, African governments, they have to place equal emphasis on affordability, that is costing, as well as equitable access and cyber security as well. Now, when it comes to India and Africa's digital cooperation, we know that both our economies, they face very similar challenges towards digital transformation, like low internet connectivity, then the skills mismatch, a mismatch in skills, and also the digital divide. But we have seen that India has successfully launched several digital initiatives in the past few years, especially in the past 5-6 years, because having a digital identity, it is the very foremost basis of functioning in a digital economy. India has launched the world's largest digital identification program, which is known as Aadhaar, which Aadhaar card, which literally Aadhaar literally means foundation. So this Aadhaar card, under it has already enrolled over 1 billion Indians, and it basically, this card uses cloud technology, which then allocates a unique 12-digit identification number based on individuals' biometric information and also demographics. So through this, India has been able to basically, through the Aadhaar card, Indians have been able to link our banking transactions, physical addresses, the phone numbers, and also pay our utility bills as well. Now, a similar comparable example of from the African side is the Ghana card, which basically also delivers public services. But unfortunately, at the moment, Ghana card's enrollment and distribution is limited. There are very limited number of printing centers as well. But at the same time, there are ample opportunities for the Ghana card to basically learn from India's Aadhaar card mainly on the usage of cloud technology for managing data, managing big data, since all these kind of Aadhaar card and all, they generate huge amounts of data. So one point of departure between these India's Aadhaar card and Ghana card is that, like, unlike India's Aadhaar card, the Ghana card basically is used as a national identity for Ghanaians, and it confers citizenship on its holders, which is not the case with India's Aadhaar card. As Grace suggested, some prominent examples are like Kenya's M-Pesa, which basically service is now almost available to around 10 African countries, serving over 30 to 40 million people. Then Nigeria's Jumia Group also, which was founded, I think, back in 2012 by Rocket Internet, if I'm not mistaken. It is also one of Nigeria's Jumia Group. It is one of Africa's best funded e-commerce startup. Basically, it has created a network of trucks and motorbikes and all, which delivers products to customers. And some other Indian initiatives also, which aims at digital transformation, has been like the Digital India initiative, which basically has brought internet connectivity to a number of gram panchayats in rural India, basically by laying optical fibers across our country. There are other initiatives like BharatNet, Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, India Stack, etc. So together, basically, with a targeted approach towards skill development, if these Indian initiatives they are implemented properly in certain African countries, after feasibility studies and everything have been conducted, then African economies stand to benefit greatly, and because it will help young Africans become more employable. Over the years, the most successful example we have seen of India-Africa Digital Tech Cooperation has been the Pan-Africa E-Network project, which was basically operational in 48 African countries, and it had its hub in Dakar, Senegal. Basically, through this project, Pan-Africa E-Network project, it provided a seamless and integrated fiber optics and wireless network, basically, which connects African countries to many super specialty hospitals in India, and also to few premier educational institutes in India. From 2008, this Pan-Africa E-Network project has now been, the second phase of it is now termed as the E-Vidya Bharti and E-Arogya Bharti project on telemedicine and tele-education. So this through this EVAB project, India will be providing over 4,000 free tele-education. Will be providing 4,000 free tele-education courses over the next 5 years, and also we are also going to provide continuing medical examinations to over 1,000 Africans each year. Also, Indian doctors, they also provide free medical consultancy to African doctors. This project, basically this Pan-Africa E-Network project and EDAB, it is basically is popularly held as a termed as a digital bridge of knowledge and health between our two geographies. This kind of thinking, line of thinking, was exactly what Prime Minister Narendra Modi implied when he was giving his address at the Ugandan Parliament in 2018. He enunciated the 10 guiding principles for India-Africa engagement. Under that, one of the guiding principles he stated, and I quote, is that India will harness its own experience with the digital revolution to support Africa's development, improve delivery of public services, extend education and health, spread digital literacy, expand financial inclusion, and mainstream the marginalized.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Abhishek. So our final speaker for today, Sheena Magenya, who was supposed to be joining us from Kenya, has not been able to join us, unfortunately, because she was facing load shedding issues, which is something that Jiska Digru did warn us about, and how we need electricity for all the digital dreams that we are dreaming just now. I would now like to invite our for closing remarks our final speaker, and it is going to be a special address from Mr. Gurjar, who is the Director of East and Southern Africa at the Ministry of External Affairs, the Government of India. Sir, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Sunaina. Is it audible? Yes, thank you very much, Sunaina. First of all, I sincere apologies from all of you, just joining late in the midst of the ongoing discussion due to some technical glitches. Respected Chair, Sri Ambassador Navdeep Suriji, distinguished Fellow and Director, Center for New Economic Diplomacy, ORF, esteemed team members of Observer Research Foundation, Ms. Sunaina Kumar and Mr. Abhishek Misra, and distinguished speakers and panelists, and my dear audience. At the outset, I would like to express my sincere thanks and to Observer Research Foundation for giving me an opportunity to touch upon India-Africa engagement in today's webinar under the theme of Africa towards a digital, sustainable, equal society. I begin with India-Africa's historical links, which goes back to 2 millennia established through maritime routes in Indian Ocean to doing trade and commerce. India and Africa came closer to understand better during the fighting against the colonialism and its evil practices, especially apartheid and racial discrimination in the first half of 20th century. India-Africa partnership was further buttressed by our vibrant Indian diaspora and professionals, which plays a significant role in our bilateral relations, especially the countries of East and Southern Africa, which I am looking after in Ministry of External Affairs. India's intense engagement with Africa have taken a robust and dynamic character in the early 21st century, which is characterized by the spirit of developing together as equals. In this regard, India had taken initiative to organize the first India-Africa Forum Summit in 2008 in New Delhi to engage African countries in a more active manner. So far, 3 editions of India-Africa Forum Summits were organized. The last India-Africa Forum Summit, third, held in 2015, which had drawn up a very ambitious action plan for India-Africa partnership for 5 years, 2015 to 2020. This partnership is based on the 4 pillars. First is the Development Partnership Persistence, which is called DPA. Under this, Government of India provides the lines of credits or concessional loans or grant assistance. Second is the trade and investment, which is also very important. And third is a robust people-to-people context, especially in areas of education and capacity building. And the last but not the least, the defense and maritime security. This partnership was further defined and expanded by our Honorable Prime Minister Sri Narendra Modi during his visit and during his address in Ugandan Parliament in July 2018, outlining 10 broad guiding principles of India's engagement with Africa. These principles make India as Africa's most steadfast and reliable partner in its developmental growth and progress. As you have noticed that India has kept its critical supply lines, especially medical and food assistance, open to Africa during the COVID pandemic and the lockdown, which is itself is a testimony and characterized as like a friend in need is a friend indeed. Our developmental partnership initiative have expanded both in geographical reach and sectoral coverage. The African continent is the second largest recipient of our overseas assistance. We have reached out to 43 countries out of 54 in Africa and executed more than 189 developmental projects in almost all sectors. During India-Africa Forum Summit 3rd in 2015, under the Developmental Partnership Assistance, Government of India has committed USD $10 billion concessional loans or lines of credits, out of which I want to mention here that more than $6 billion has already been sanctioned. Under capacity building and skill development, we announced 50,000 scholarship to the African youth during India-Africa Forum Summit 3rd, out of which more than 42,000 scholarships have already been utilized till December 2020. GOI has also announced to give US $600 million as a grant assistance for some important projects, which has exceeded to the US $700 million. Since third India-Africa Forum Summit, our engagement with Africa has intensified in all fields. There have been unprecedented 34 outgoing visits by our Prime Minister, our Vice President and President to Africa, and more than 100 incoming visits from all levels, high levels and ministerial levels from Africa during the same period. In order to expand its footprints in Africa, Government of India has decided to open 18 new diplomatic missions in Africa in 2018. Out of 18, 12 missions have already been opened. Only 6 missions in Liberia, Chad, Mauritania, Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau and Somalia are yet to be opened, but they are under process. On trade and economic fronts, India's trade with Africa has registered at $69.6 billion in 2018-19, which has slightly decreased in last financial year due to COVID pandemic and the disruption of global supply chain. India has become the 5th largest investor in Africa with the cumulative investments at USD $54 billion. India has the largest investment tune of more than $6 billion in Mozambique. Sizable investments have been made in, especially in oil and gas, mining, banking, textile and other sectors. You all are very much aware that African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, has recently come into force from January 1st, 2021, which will certainly provide an opportunity to African nations to have more intra-Africa trade like a EU, common market. I am of the view that African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement will be a game changer in further deepening India-Africa trade and commerce. With regard to the today's theme, Africa towards a digital, sustainable, equal society, as Abhishek has mentioned on the telemedicine and tele-education, I would like to highlight that India is also helping the African countries in this endeavor to bridge the digital divide. The Pan-African E-Network was launched in Africa at the continental level in 2009, aimed at narrowing the digital gap in Africa and harnessing socio-economic benefits of ICT. The first phase of this program was over in 2017, and now we are offering 15,000 scholarships over a period of 5 years through the second phase of the project, renamed as E-Vidya Bharti for tele-education and E-Arogya Bharti network project for telemedicine, which is called eWeb, eWeb. So far, 17 countries have signed the MOU to become partner countries under the E-Vidya Bharti and E-Arogya Bharti. During the last 5 years, 6 IT centers in South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, Lesotho, Ghana, Namibia and Tanzania, and a Center for Geoinformatics Applications in Rural Development called Seaguard Technology Center in Madagascar and Niger were also established to promote digital transformation in Africa. A technology center in Zimbabwe was also upgraded. India-Africa cooperation in defense and maritime security domain is mainly driven by Government of India's and Prime Minister's vision or SAGAR, Security and Growth for All in the Region policy. It includes active role in humanitarian and disaster relief operations, HADR operations, especially evacuation efforts and supplying relief materials and counter-terrorism and anti-piracy to ensure free and secure maritime navigation. India continues to contribute for stability in the continent and work with the various stakeholders. Currently, Indians serve in 5 peacekeeping operations in Africa for African Union's strategic goal and vision for silencing the guns by 2020. Our defense and security cooperation is growing rapidly with nations in Africa, boosting people-to-people contacts. GOI has extended e-tourist visa facility to 33 African countries to further strengthen relations with Africa. We have signed an air transport bubble arrangement with the 5 countries so far: Nigeria, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda. In this regard, to maintain the smooth travel of citizens, even during the ongoing pandemic. With this remark, I would like to conclude my address on positive note that India-Africa relations will continue to embark on mutual trust and faith in all spheres. I believe that African continental free trade area will further provide an impetus to India to play a defining role in supporting Africa's economic integration with deeper engagement in the region's industrial and infrastructure development projects as a time-tested partner of Africa. Once again, I thank you very much to respected Chair and ORF Foundation for giving me the platform to share my views on India-Africa engagements. I wish ORF all success for its future endeavors. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's actually a great note to close at the discussion. And we don't have much time left. And considering that our speakers have other engagements as well, and Jiska de Groot already had to leave, I'm going to invite all of our speakers to answer this one question quickly, which is that if there is one intervention that you would like to see in your country or even in the continent that can help it achieve the digital and sustainable goals, what would it be?
Thank you for that question, Sunaina. I would say that, with the emphasis of the work that we have already embarked on as an organization, there are ways in which we could really see how to improve using, mobile features as well as just even radio and TV programs in order to be able to be more relevant as well as really reach the students that we work with. We have realized that these low-tech solutions are available, right? They're available in most regions as well as throughout the country. So just ways in which we could really focus on advancing and accelerating them so that they could be more relevant to the students as well as young people that we work with. Thank you.
Thank you. Lobna, what do you think?
So I would say that the first thing in order to ensure technological sustainability is, of course, increase the infrastructure, strengthen it, and extend it to rural areas. And along with that, there has to be media and digital literacy. So we can improve the engagement, increase the pluralism when it comes to voicing the opinions and to ensure freedom of expression. Thank you.
Abhishek, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, so what I would like to say is that unlike other countries in Asia, especially China or Korea or Singapore, what I would suggest is that India being a large federal democracy, we provide a more, if I may say, a relatable model to the current challenges which African countries face than the other Asian counterparts. So India's digital transformation, basically, it can serve as a better model to how to further understand how Africa can basically digitally transform and compete globally. And in that endeavors, certainly opportunities for collaboration between us to bridge the digital divide, there are ample. Yeah.
Thank you. Ambassador Suri, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think what emerges is that we shouldn't let challenges of technology, telecommunications, or energy defeat the larger objective of trying to leapfrog, in the development path. I think what Grace has mentioned, what Michepe has mentioned, is there are different pathways available. You can have a low-tech pathway. You could use WhatsApp and SMSs for some purposes, and you can use high-end video. And I think in what we see in India, and that's also relevant in many cities in Africa, is a kind of a two-speed economy. What you see in terms of infrastructure in Delhi or Mumbai or Bangalore is not what you get in some of the hinterland. And I think, many places in Africa are not so different. So I recognize that this may not meet the inclusive part of the agenda, but it certainly is advances the causes of digital literacy and sustainability that we are talking about. So, I see that we talk a lot about the challenges, but I think if there's one thing that we need to internalize is let's go ahead and do what we can. And once the demand is there, the infrastructure is likely to catch up.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And it seems like Grace is here. Grace, are you with us?
Yes, I am. And I don't know what to add to what Ambassador Suri has said. One thing that's really interesting is, or that's something I'd like to see, is more focus on the digital as we get into the Africa continent. There's a lot of focus on the traditional trade areas, but there hasn't been as much focus on the digital part of it. So we haven't thought about issues like, what if we all had the same data protection laws, and therefore Africans would be able to, move data around Africa and make something out of that data and create, a lot of opportunities for ourselves. That would be something to think about. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you also for everyone's patience while we faced some technical issues throughout this session today. But I think there were a lot of takeaways from this. Thank you to our speakers and to our audience. And thank you for your interest in this topic, Africa in 2021. It's certainly something that we intend to engage with throughout this year and also ahead at the Center for New Economic Diplomacy. So do keep up with that if you are interested. Have a good day and thank you.